Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Combat Zone, where the enemy only has four things to say: abandon ship, bail out, take cover, and we surrender. I'm Nick, he's Joseph, and in studio tonight we have with us Tom Harris from the International Climate Science Coalition. Did I get that right, Tom?
You got that right. Yeah.
Hot dog. I'm on a roll tonight. I am on fire. Okay, so we're going to go right. We're just going to dive right into this. Tom is here. We've asked him to come in and be a part of the show this evening to talk about. There's been climate change is always in the news in some form, but lately it's just gotten. The well of stupid has gotten a lot deeper. They've been digging like crazy. And I'm not just talking about Justin Trudeau and LabScam. We're talking about on a global scale, the level of stupid is getting ridiculous. So, first of all, Tom, before we get into that, what have you been up to?
Yeah, well, we've been looking at this Canada report. We've been getting articles out on, the climate issue across the world, the fact that we've had an extremely cold winter. I mean, this is the 7th month in a row where we've had snow on the ground in Ottawa, 7 straight months.
Five months with snow on the ground consistently.
Yes.
So I was in Vienna last summer in the middle of a heat wave, and we were all complaining about how hot it was, and it was hot. And I was at a conference, and the facility we were in, beautiful modern facility, no air conditioning. And I was there for a week, and everybody is whining about the heat. So we have this group on WhatsApp, and just yesterday morning I got up and I took my phone and I clicked outside, another snowy day in Ottawa, and I said, it's making me long for that heat wave in Vienna. Yeah. So, it's 5 months, almost 5 months since the 13th of November.
149
to
days.
see the grass
so
outside my house.
Yeah. Well, I remember it snowed in October, but I guess it must have gone away. And, of course, now we're into April. So that was showing that at least at some point in 7 straight months, there was snow on the ground in Ottawa. And it's interesting because records were set all across Canada, all across the United States as well. And this actually ties in with people like Dr. Ball's idea that we're actually headed for global cooling because the sun is entering into a weak phase around the middle of this century. But this report on Canada, it's called Canada's Changing Climate Report.
Now this is the report that the federal government leaked.
That's right. They leaked accidentally on April Fool's Day, which is quite appropriate.
Right.
How do you leak something accidentally?
Well, that's right. And, CBC and everybody else. CBC says Canada warming at twice the global rate. Leaked report finds. And you say, well, why would they leak it? Because, of course, it sounds nefarious. There's something going on. The media are going to be more interested. Yes. But leaking through a state-sponsored broadcaster doesn't sound like leaking. It sounds more like releasing.
But what gets me about this is, doesn't anybody actually think about what they're saying? I mean, how does one geographical area the size of Canada heat up at twice the rate of everybody else, but the States doesn't?
Well, this was something we were joking around about last week, that if things get too hot here in Ottawa, we know that we could just pack up and head down to Ogdensburg, because once we cross that border, the rate of heating will be reduced by 50%.
Yep, just
Well, one thing that people have to realize is they were talking about the rate of heating the Arctic is 3 times the global average. But it's interesting. There is only one station in the entire Arctic archipelago and Arctic islands that they use in the data. One station. It's Eureka, and they chose it deliberately because it's a well-known warm anomaly in the Arctic, and it accounts for most of the Arctic warming in the Canadian sector. But it's one data point. One station.
So that's like looking at one stock on the stock exchange and predicting how the whole stock exchange is going to perform.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean,
that's a good analogy, but people actually do that probably. So
I'm sure they do, and I bet you they're broke too.
Well, in the Globe and Mail article, I believe that was this Dr. Shepard who was introduced. He's a Canadian government employee. And by the way, this report was authored by 42 people, 26 of which work for the Environment and Climate Change Canada Department. And yet in their press release, the government calls them independent scientists, an independent analysis. But 26 of the 42 work for Catherine McKenna through her department. The total is 5 don't work for the government, and of course they probably have government grants. But to call it an independent analysis is pretty silly. I mean, they told the government decades ago that we were headed into global warming crisis. So that's become the policy. So you can be sure that the scientists in that department are not going to say anything different.
Of course not. They like their jobs. And as much as Phoenix is a mess, they still like to get paid.
Yeah. And of course, they go much beyond just saying what's happening now. They actually talk about what's going to happen in the future. In fact, they give the media, they have various headline statements, okay, which they're hoping the media pick up on, and they do. It says, Canada's climate has warmed and will warm further in the future, driven by human influence. You know, it says, and it talks all about this future. Well, how do they know that? Of course, what they're using is the IPCC models. And the worst of all the models, I mean, they're all bad, but the worst of them is the Canadian model. They forecast on average over several decades, these IPCC models forecast about 3 times as much warming has actually occurred. So to try to actually forecast the future, I mean, using these models doesn't make any sense at all.
Let me just interject and just do a little bit of housekeeping here before we go on, because I know that people are making comments in the comments section, etc. So please, if you guys want to make comments, great. Don't forget to hit the refresh button or refresh link on the comment section so that you're getting updated comments on a regular basis. Also, you know, normally we take phone calls all the way through the show. But with our special guest tonight, Tom Harris, we're not going to open up our phone lines until the second hour of the show, which would be 10 p.m. So just wanted to make sure people were understanding. If you're calling in and jamming the phone lines and wondering why we aren't taking calls, it's because we just want to get through here, let Tom talk a little bit about, then we'll open up the phone lines in the second hour of the show. Sorry to interrupt, guys, but I thought we should just cover off that housekeeping stuff.
Good point. Now, when you lost conversation, I was thinking, well, while you were talking, I found out I can chew gum and walk at the same time. It made
I can't.
No, well, believe me, it's a trick.
Yeah.
But especially if you get it on the bottom of your shoe, it's a mess. Anyway, the point is that how many of the predictions, and you'll know this a lot better than I do. I've got a feeling I know the answer, but of all the dire predictions that have been made since this first broke on the scene back in the 1990s, I remember Al Gore saying, we have 10 years to save the planet. 11 years later, we have 10 years to save the planet. How many of those kind of predictions have actually come true?
Well, none, really. And in fact, none of the computer models have worked. None of the forecasts have come true. It's interesting. I was at a presentation, I guess, 4 years ago at the Aviation Museum put on by, I'm not sure which ecology group it was, but regardless, they brought in Olympic skiers saying it was the end of snow in Canada.
Oh, brother.
You know, and of course, Tom being what I am, I got up and said, well, actually, here's a graph that shows snow cover in North America, which was gradually increasing over the years. And of course, in January, I believe it was, we had the most snow ever in Ottawa's history for that time frame. And so the idea that we're losing snow is, of course, ridiculous. But you know, it is interesting that you have to also ask, if all the computer models are wrong, then what is the climate scare based on? Well, the sad thing is it's not really based on anything, because observations in the real world tell us that climate change is just within natural variability. There's nothing extraordinary that's happened. If you believe in a global average temperature, which is another concept we can talk about because it's kind of a fictitious thing, it's a statistic, the NASA says that the temperature increased since 1880, during which time there's been about a 40% rise in CO2 in the atmosphere. The temperature's gone up just over 1 degree Celsius. 1 degree. And of course, extreme weather is not increasing. The records for tornadoes even was set many decades ago.
Right.
We find that the hurricane frequency to hit the United States, they had a drought that was the longest drought they've had in American history until the recent ones. So sea levels rising, of course, because it's been rising for 10,000 years, but it's rising much more slowly than it was, say, 8,000 years ago when there was a lot more ice to melt. So in the real world, we see that there is nothing extraordinary going on. So the climate scare is based entirely on the forecasts of computer models that don't work. And, when I met with the Environment Minister after one of the town halls, Catherine McKenna, about a year ago, I gave her a copy of the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change. It's a huge document, about 1,000 pages, thousands of references.
I've seen it.
Yeah, which show that, in fact, much of the climate scare is just not based on solid science. And I was astounded that she didn't even realize that there are legitimate, peer-reviewed science and science papers coming out on the other side. She didn't know about it at all. And her primary comment when I gave her the document, and I also gave her a summary, because, I'm not going to expect the minister to read 1,000 pages, but I gave her a summary as well. She said it was heavy to carry back to her car. Now, within days, of course, she was giving the same old message, so it didn't seem to sink in. But the bottom line is, I was very surprised. She didn't really understand. She hadn't heard of me or the International Climate Science Coalition. I don't think she'd even heard of people like Tim Ball. Tim Ball is so well known. In fact, we have an article about to come out on the Canadian Climate Report, and he just takes it apart. They're focused in this report on temperature. And as he points out, drought and flood are a far more serious issue.
Yes.
But the bottom line is, as he says right here, he says, when you put it in a historical context, the Climate Change Canada, whatever it's called, the CCR 2019 report, he said, it's pretty insignificant because it has been warmer than today for at least 90% of the last 10,000 years. People don't realize that. There's a couple of statistics there. One is it has been warmer for 90% of the last 10,000 years than it is today. Okay? That's number one. The second point, and this is something people don't understand, is we're at one of the lowest levels of CO2 in Earth's history. Okay? At 410 parts per million. People say, oh my God, that's a 40% rise since 1880. That's peanuts. Okay? That's nothing. Because 450 million years ago, when the Earth was in a very cold phase, the CO2 level was 1,000%, 10 times what it is today. So we're much closer to the level at which plants start to die than we are to any dangerous upper level. And right now in this room, I'll bet you the CO2 is 600 parts per million. By the end of our discussion, it'll probably be 1,000, because in a crowded conference room, it's typically 1,000 parts per million. So it's not a hazard. And it's certainly not causing global warming, at least not to any appreciable extent.
Well, we see, and there's evidence, I want to say layman's evidence, but there's real-world evidence to back this up. First of all, greenhouses have carbon dioxide injectors to raise the level of CO2 in the greenhouse to somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 parts per million, because the plants do so much better.
Oh, yeah, and they use less water, too.
Yeah, because they don't have to go through as much of the photosynthetic process, and therefore they're more efficient. It's like learning to, if you're a long-distance runner, your lungs become more efficient. Same thing with plants with photosynthesis. But in submarines, the guys live in up to 3,500 parts per million. Yeah. It's a closed environment. It's a micro environment. I mean, 300 feet of pinched off sewer pipe, the CO2 is going to go up. And as a matter of fact, during World War II, they used to have to put out cakes that would absorb CO2, big soda, whatever they were made of, I don't know. There's not the kind of cake you'd take out of an oven. But they were specifically designed to draw carbon dioxide out of the air, because the CO2 level was, in those cases, getting, to the point where it was going to have an impact on the crew. They worried more about the CO2 poisoning. But up until then, I think the limit is about 4,500 or more before you start running into trouble.
Yeah, and you got to remember, that's in comparison with atmospheric levels at 410.
Yes.
So, we could double, quadruple the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere, and it has no threat to humans. And in fact, over the last century, the increase in CO2 has resulted in a massive increase in crop yield across the world and densification of forests. So CO2 rise has been a good thing. It's been a good thing, and the amount of warming has been very small, almost totally due to the sun, undoubtedly. It is interesting, though, that you have to remember that CO2, which they call carbon pollution, in so many government documents right now, is not carbon, because carbon is a solid substance. In fact, soot is carbon, particulates, and it's not pollution. CO2 is the stuff of life. So the whole idea of reducing carbon pollution, what's she talking about? It's complete 1984 Newspeak. If you go to the appendix in 1984, that book, and you read the description of Newspeak, that's what we're hearing throughout the whole climate debate. They talk about energy sources that have low CO2 emissions as being green energy sources. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, green energy sources would presumably be ones that help make more green, make more plants.
Right.
So, in fact, if you're putting out more and more CO2, those are green energy sources. But the language has been completely turned upside down.
So I'm curious, Tom, I don't know if there's a good answer to this question, but what is the origin of the theory that carbon dioxide is the culprit behind global warming? Okay, because, we can have an argument about global warming, all right? We can have an argument about greenhouse gases, but what specifically led certain scientists to the theory that it was carbon dioxide that was causing this?
Well, it starts back in the previous century, in the 19th century, with Arrhenius, who is the, I believe he's Swedish professor who did research on CO2 and showed that it was a greenhouse gas.
The 20th century, you mean?
No, 1900.
The 1900s or 1800s? Okay, just wanted to clarify that. Okay.
But he later actually withdrew a fair bit of what he was saying, and it turned out that water vapor was, in fact, the bigger contributor, much bigger. By a long shot. Now, the whole issue of whether CO2 is really a greenhouse gas is, believe it or not, under debate. You have people like Dr. Ball who say that it is not a greenhouse gas. It does not cause warming. And there are lots of evidence to support what he's saying, because throughout the record, both reasonably short-term and the geologic record over hundreds of millions of years, you see a common thread. What you see is temperature goes up first, and then CO2 responds following later. So people like Dr. Ball say, well, then clearly CO2 is not causing warming. CO2 is being released as a result of, let's say, the oceans warming. If you leave a can of soda on your counter and it warms up, it releases the CO2, okay? That's because it's warming up. The oceans release CO2 when they warm. So people like Dr. Ball say that it is not a greenhouse gas at all, that it does not cause warming, and that the basic theories are wrong, and the data supports what he's saying. Then you have what are called the lukewarmers, okay? People like Patrick Michaels from the Cato Institute, previously with the University of Virginia. He says, yes, it's causing some warming, but not very much. And then you have people into, there's a whole spectrum. And so, I mean, the idea that there is one solid and definite answer to this, if the science is settled, we don't even know for sure that CO2 warms the planet at all. And indeed, the amount it warms must be very small, because since the beginning of the century, CO2 has continued to rise because of the industrialization of China. But temperatures have stalled. They have plateaued. We're in what they call the global warming hiatus.
Okay, the global warming pause.
Yeah, that's right. It doesn't.
No, that's an actual term. That's
hiatus. Yeah, they call it the hiatus. And of course, they have all sorts of ideas and theories as to why is it that CO2 rise is not causing warming. We don't get it. And
because we don't want to admit we're wrong.
Well, yeah, and people like Dr. Ball, and I'm not an expert in the infrared radiative transfer of it, but people like him are. They say it's because CO2 is not driving temperature. It's a result of temperature rise, which occurs due to other factors. So to answer your question, I can't answer your question, but I can tell you that there's a huge debate. And you see these scientists going back and forth with complex calculations showing it does or it doesn't cause a little warming or a lot or none at all. Oof, we just don't know. And what we do know, though, is a 40% rise since 1880. There's only been 1 degree Celsius rise.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about is we talked a little bit about renewables, this whole idea that these things are green. I've always maintained, if you look at, let's say, this the move towards electric cars is far worse for the planet than staying with the internal combustion engine. Mm-hmm. And the reason is, if you look at what goes into the batteries, the lithium, the what's the other one?
Nickel.
Nickel, yes. There's another rare earth metal they put in it. I want to say cadmium, but I don't think I'm right. Anyway, there's 2 of these metals that are mined in China and in Africa, and they don't care one whit for the environment. I mean, I went to a website or to a just Google images of rare earth metal mining out of China, and you've got pits you could put Lake Superior in.
Yeah.
I mean, these things are massive. And in Africa, they're using child labor as young as 4 to carry these blocks of ore up, and they're using child slave labor and decimating the local environment in the process. And when you pick up your cell phone, guess what's in it?
Yeah.
You know, now we all love our cell phones. I have one too. So I'm not trying to paint myself as any kind of, altruistic, perfect kind of person. I'm as guilty as the next guy. But the point is that the damage being done by these kinds of things, I think, is far worse than we already have.
Well, yeah, I attended a presentation last week from a Dr. Elizabeth Anderson, who actually spoke at Tim Patterson's course at Carleton University. And Liz is actually Tim's wife, and they got 2 PhDs, married. And she gave a presentation specifically on the environmental impacts of solar power. The week before, she did it on wind power. And the environmental impacts are terrible. In fact, she's saying things like wind power is probably the most dirty energy source on the planet because they use rare earth metals in the magnets, in the supermagnets that are used. And of course, they're mined in China, and that this is incredibly polluting. And she went through in the lecture I went to, it was on the environmental costs of solar power, and she went through all the silicosis, I think it's called, the silicon-related diseases that are related to people being exposed to silicon in various forms. She went through all the incredible pollution. The top most the green city in China, where they make I believe more green technology than any other place in China. I can't remember the name of it. I'll look it up later. But it's one of the most polluted cities on the planet, okay? Because they're making these energy sources with all of these elements. And, of course, they use coal-fired power to generate the electricity to make the wind turbines. And China doesn't care very much about the pollution produced by it. Our coal-fired power is much cleaner.
Oh, yeah.
Of course, we use, generally speaking, fairly high-grade coal as well. But the bottom line is, the pollution produced by even CO2, even if you counted carbon dioxide as a pollutant, which it isn't, it's debatable as to whether they actually save any CO2 at all because of the manufacturing processes.
Well, the mineral I was thinking of was lithium.
Okay, right.
Okay, and they do a lot of that in South Africa too. In South Africa, yes, in South America. And one of the most there's a lake. It's a salt lake, like Salt Lake City, Utah. Yeah. But there's a crust, probably about 6 up to a foot thick, and these guys carve blocks of this lithium out of the lake. And the working conditions are unbelievable. Yeah. Like none of us would ever even dream of spending a day out there, never mind earning your living that way. Yeah. Because you're in the Andes. You're at 10, 12,000 feet. So you're right on the line about how much you can handle because of oxygen deprivation. What's the name of that disease, the sickness you get if you get too high in an airplane with no oxygen?
Hypoxia.
That's it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so these guys struggle with that all the time because they're right on that line. So I just think it's amazing when you try to tell people this, and they look at you and like, well, it's for the good of the planet. Yeah. If it's for the good of the planet, then why are you doing it? Because you're killing the planet in the process.
Yeah, it's because it's a huge business. And in fact, this is something people don't realize. People on the left have been completely bamboozled. They say that they're social justice warriors. They're concerned for the poor and the disadvantaged. Well, here are some numbers that might make the left just sort of wake up. A group called Climate Policy Initiative out of San Francisco says that over $1 billion U.S. a day is being spent on climate finance, which, by the way, they say is not enough.
Of course not.
No. Now, the UN wanted half of that money out of Copenhagen. They wanted half the money to go to helping people adapt to climate change, which makes sense. I mean, climate always changes, and people need help. The other half is going to try to stop it, which doesn't make sense. That's what the UN target was, a 50-50 split. The actual ratio, and people can check it out on the web, just Google Climate Policy Initiative, and they track down where this $1 billion a day is being spent. 95% of it goes to try to stop climate change. The people in the world who need help adapting to climate change get 5% of the money. Right. And yet there are many things that the left, you would think, would support helping vulnerable people adapt to climate change.
Well, look at this whole fair trade thing with coffee and with other, agricultural products, or they want to put an end to sweatshops in Bangladesh making T-shirts.
Yeah.
All right, noble cause. But don't you mess with my cell phone.
Yeah.
They put on these blinders that says, I'll tolerate it under these conditions, but over here we can't have that.
And not only that, Nick, you have to realize that what is climate mitigation? Where is the money going? It's primarily going to things like wind turbines, okay, which makes huge profits for big corporations. The kind of money that would be used, the kind of things that would be done with adaptation money would be building wells or moving populations out of areas that are becoming increasingly dry or in some way not habitable, okay? But those are boots on the ground type projects that you would think the left would support. They don't make money for big corporations. But indeed, that's what's needed. And, there's some things like in Ottawa, how would we adapt to climate change? Well, one of the things we should do is bury our cables underground, okay? There was a study done in 2011, and I discussed that in the Toronto Sun article that I wrote back in June, I believe. And they actually talk about the cost of it being, $2 to $5 million per kilometer to bury overhead cable underground. It depends on where it is, how much
rock you got to go
right.
through.
So they said, well, we can't afford it. Unless it's being paid for by some sort of private source of money, the city can't afford it. Okay? But the capital of Canada can't afford to protect its power lines. Now think about that. 1 year's expenditure of the carbon tax, according to the recent numbers of a few months ago, I don't have them exactly now, is $10 billion. That would pay for about 2,000 kilometers of underground cable. So instead of making our system more robust and better able to adapt to whatever happens around us, which can be another tornado someday or whatever.
Who knows?
We're spending money on trying to stop climate change when Canada only puts out 1.7% of world emissions of CO2, if you believe that it mattered.
Wait a minute.
Yeah, of course we can afford to bury them underground. Just get rid of this stupid climate policy.
Isn't this the same city that just spent how much on a glorified trolley with overhead wires that occasionally runs through a covered ditch?
Yeah.
Aren't we in the same city?
Yeah, the same city that didn't clear our roads properly all winter.
The same city that now has a leaky subway where the concrete was poured and it leaks and some pumps can't keep up to it when it leaks.
Yeah, it's pretty bad management.
Holy smokes. All right.
I hear that I also hear that one of the councilmen is going to be introducing a motion at the next...
That's on my list.
That's on your list of things to talk about?
Yes.
To declare a climate
emergency
in Ottawa.
Ho-ho.
A climate emergency.
Councillor Sean Menard.
Is that who it is?
Yes. And that's being debated on Thursday.
It's in reaction to this leaked report, by the way.
Oh, is that right?
Oh, my God. There's so much. When you listen to the whereases in it, it's like, are you crazy? Are you out of your mind?
Yeah.
How do people like you get elected? Because a whole bunch of people just like you. Anyway.
Well, we can talk about it later, but the public do not support this. And polls show it, We'll talk about it later.
All right.
Okay, well, we're coming up on our first break, so stay tuned, guys. Get up, stretch your legs, and we'll be back on the other side, right here in the Combat Zone. Okay, hey, I'm Joe, he's Nick, and you are entering back into the Combat Zone. And our guest tonight here is Tom Harris from the International Climate Science Coalition. And I got distracted because my phone started buzzing and there's nothing worse than, the only thing worse than your phone going off full blast loud when you're on the air is having it in your pocket when it's on vibrate. because that doesn't distract anyone but you.
And
Anyway.
then people look at you and go, "What's your problem?"
People go, yeah, well, nobody's looking at me right now. Well, you guys are, but I'm not really acting that funny, eh?
Well, what's next on the topic list?
Okay. Look, what do I want to say? Yeah, we're going to be opening up our phone lines in hour number 2, so don't bother calling in, even though it says you can call in toll-free anywhere in North America. As I said, our guest is Tom Harris. And just a reminder that if you're making comments, don't forget that you can refresh, and you should refresh your comment section every now and then by clicking on the refresh comments link on the webpage. That way you can stay current on what people are saying or not saying. So,
All right.
where are we here on this topic?
Okay, let's take care of the climate emergency first, because that's what we were just talking about.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
So let me bring you up to speed if you haven't heard, for those who haven't heard. Councillor Sean Menard here in the city of Ottawa, he's in a ward called the Glebe. Now, if you live in Ottawa, that's all I need to say. And if you don't live in Ottawa, you don't care. So, he is not exactly what I would call a conservative in his outlook. He's a little more green than that. And it's a funny term, considering what we've just been talking about.
Saying.
And he's decided that based on this leaked document that we just spent the last half hour talking about, he's decided that he's put together an 11-page motion.
Whoa.
11 pages. It's not just this is not symbolic for him. He's been working on this for a couple of months. And he wants to declare in City of Ottawa, like a lot of other jurisdictions across the country. Kingston did it the other day. I think it's been done in Calgary, which wouldn't surprise me, knowing the mayor out there. And in several cities, Vancouver and Victoria, well, no surprise there. They have a real climate problem out there. Heaven forbid, it might be a little bit warmer in Vancouver in the summertime and warmer in the winter. Anyway, I'm not too bitter about their summers or winters. Anyway, so he's decided that this calls for immediate action, because after all, we only have 11 years left.
Till 2030, oh my God.
Till till we're all dead.
Yeah.
There's no soft pedaling this. That's it. We've got 11 years to save the planet, or we're all doomed. I mean, what kind of nonsense is this?
Yeah, he obviously doesn't know what's really happening in the real world. I mean, I think a lot of the scientists would just even on the global warming side would just laugh at that sort of point, because I mean, we're talking about a couple of degrees rise over a century if you believe the alarmism. I mean, we're just really not talking about the kind of catastrophe that these people are talking about. And he should really look at the stats, because the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States has probably the best database of extreme weather records anywhere in the world, okay? They look at, for each state, they look at the maximum temperature, the minimum temperature, the most snow, the most rain, all sorts of things. In all of 2018, there was one record set, okay? One record. It was the largest hailstone in the history of Alabama. Well, I think we talked about this last time. It was 5+ inches in diameter. Okay?
Holy cow.
And imagine if one was 5 inches, there were probably a whole lot that were 3 and 4 inches. So I mean,
and some of them that were bigger.
Yeah,
no, if that's the largest.
Yeah,
yes.
that's right. And if you look at the whole of the 21st century,
that would kill people.
We're 19 years into the 21st century. There are only 2 states. I believe it's North Dakota and South Dakota. North Dakota and North Carolina. I'll have to double check on that. But one of those two
northern states.
I'm pretty sure it's North. I'll check it later. But North Dakota and North Carolina, 2 states set their maximum temperature record in the whole of the 19 years of the 21st century. Okay, now you contrast that to 1 year in the 1930s. In 1 year, they set 15, which still stand, by the way, 15 maximum temperature records. Okay, so we're talking about 15 in 1 year. I believe it was 1936, in comparison with 2 in 19 years. Okay?
Maybe that's why they had the Dust Bowl.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, all they need to do really is take a look at what's really going on in the real world, and they can see that there is nothing extraordinary going on. The kinds of temperature changes, the kinds of sea level changes, the kinds of extreme weather changes, these are normal events. Okay?
See, I think that what we're dancing around here is one of the biggest issues in this debate, and that is that people are so inconversant with basic science. They don't read. They have no curiosity beyond what they're getting fed by the mainstream media. And by the way, I include in that mainstream media players themselves. Mm-hmm. And so whatever looks plausible based on, the argument that there's scientific evidence behind it or whatever, it's sort of like this vaccination thing that's going on right now.
Right.
The whole debate about whether or not vaccinations are dangerous or not dangerous, whether you should have your child vaccinated or not. Okay, at some point in time, people have to have a better basic understanding of the world they live in and a little bit of curiosity beyond, mm-hmm. What you happen to hear in your car radio driving home. And I think that's got to be a major feeding factor in this particular debate.
I think in the case of global warming or in climate, it has passed the point of just being about the science, because it doesn't take long to refute the arguments of mm-hmm. the other side. Well, this is now taking on the hallmarks of a religion, mm-hmm. and the main underpinnings of it are sacred, and you cannot attack them. And if you do, you're a heretic.
Oh yeah, you're anti-environmental if you disagree. And we have to realize that if you increase CO2, and if you believe, even people like Pat Michaels, the lukewarmers, you're talking about maybe a degree rise, something like that, with a doubling of CO2. But of course, what the alarmists are saying is that, well, if the world warms, then you'll have more water vapor evaporating, and water vapor is a greenhouse gas, so you might get 3 or 5 degrees. You might get quite a lot more. But what they don't realize is that that's a very uncertain connection, because as you increase water vapor, which is a greenhouse gas,
right.
you also increase clouds, and cloud cover cools the planet overall.
Because it reflects a lot of the sun's energy back into space.
Right. So indeed, that's a negative feedback, which basically reduces the amount of warming that you'd get otherwise. But this is all such an unknown field. And, the whole idea about the impact of clouds, it is so important. I was reading the other day that the impact of clouds is something like 10 times the impact of all human activities combined. And yet we don't know overall what impact that's going to have on the future and what impact the sun has on affecting clouds. Because think about it. This is something I think we spoke about last time. But they've shown recently, not just in theory, but also in experimenting in the CERN laboratory, that when cosmic rays come in from space, they actually generate cloud nuclei, okay? They actually form, it results in more clouds. And so when the sun is brighter, there are two things that happen. First of all, there's a little bit more incident radiation that warms the planet. But when the sun's brighter, it also has other factors like solar wind and magnetic field that pushes away the cosmic rays that otherwise would cause clouds, so the Earth becomes less cloudy. And that also increases the warming. And in fact, the interesting thing is that if you look at the impact of the sun, when you count that factor, not just the direct heating, but also the fact that you're going to have less clouds because the various emissions from the sun push away the galactic cosmic rays that are coming in, then you end up with, 2/3 of all the warming could very well be caused just by changes in the sun. Now, of course, there's other factors too, like ocean currents, things like that. So the amount that's left over for carbon dioxide to cause warming is certainly a minority. And we're talking about, as I say, just 1 degree over the last 140 years. So the amount that CO2 is causing is almost certainly very, very small. But regardless, warming is a good thing. Okay? And this is something that people just don't seem to have through their head. When I look at this report, the climate change report that came out on April Fool's Day, very appropriate, timed with the carbon tax beginning on April Fool's Day, they're assuming that warming is a bad thing. And I have a statistic here that I should just pull up quickly because it talks about the difference between warming and cooling as to the effect of mortality. Okay, I'll just pull it up here. It says it was from the British medical journal, The Lancet, and it said the following, and I read directly a quote. Cold weather kills 20 times as many people as hot weather, according to an international study analyzing over 74 million deaths in 384 locations nations across 13 countries. Okay, so cold is the big danger. That's when we have famine. That's when we have more wars and all kinds of problems. It's during warm periods that society flourishes. It was during the Roman warm period when the Roman Empire was able to expand because they could easily get food. It was during the medieval warm period when we built the great cathedrals. Okay, it's warm times that are good. And in fact, a friend of mine from India, he's a climate scientist, he laughs. He says, "You Canadians are hilarious." He says, "You're worried about warming in Canada? India has had far more warming than most of the world, and we've had the Green Revolution." You know, so I mean, the whole idea that warming is bad, it just does not fit with history. History shows that warm periods are good. So I hope it does continue to warm gradually, and I hope CO2 does continue to increase.
Well, there's no doubt about that. Now, you mentioned something in that you hit on the carbon tax. So let's talk about that for a little bit. Not so much the actual numbers, but the philosophy that drives it.
Well, there are a few numbers that are worth pointing out.
Okay.
Back in May, I wrote an article for the Toronto Sun, and in it, I quoted from the Parliamentary Budget Officer's report. And he said that the proposed federal carbon tax will suck $10 billion out of the Canadian economy in 2022, because, of course, the amount is rising per year. So I reached out to an American expert by the name of Pat Michaels, who I mentioned earlier, who does think that we are causing warming as a result of our CO2 emissions. And he used what's called the MAGIC model, which is sort of makes sense, but it's the one that's used by the Environmental Protection Agency. It's an alarmist model, basically. I mean, they're saying CO2 drives warming. And he says that the effect of Canada's emissions reductions, which remember, it's going to cost us $10 billion in 2022, he said it would result in between 1/1000th and 2/1000th of a degree Celsius less warming by 2100 than would otherwise occur. Okay? So the bottom line is that Canada, which represents 1.7% of world emissions, if we bring in the carbon tax, well, we are bringing it in, the impact is so small you can't measure it. Okay, so what would be the answer Catherine McKenna would give if she was sitting right here? Well, she would probably give the same answer that the previous head of the EPA, Gina McCarthy, gave when they asked her that question in congressional hearings. She said they had to set an example to the world, okay? It was to show leadership because, of course, China puts out twice as much carbon dioxide than the United States, okay? So the question then is, are they going to follow our leadership if we indeed crucify ourselves to set this example? Because it's not going to help the environment to speak of, but will it set an example that they'll follow? Well, the answer is no. Not only does the Paris Agreement allow China to increase emissions all the way to 2030, but there's an out clause in the underlying treaty, underlying the Paris Agreement, and in fact all UN climate agreements, is something called the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Okay, it was signed in Rio at the Earth Summit in 1992. 92, right, by Brian Mulroney and George Bush the First. And it gives an out clause. It says the first and overriding priority of developing countries, they consider China still a developing country. Send us all your money, we're still developing. The first and overriding priority of developing countries is poverty alleviation and development. Okay? So, do you think they're going to turn off their cheapest form of power, which of course is coal? About 80% of China's electricity is coal. Are they going to turn off their cheapest form of power if their first and overriding priority is poverty alleviation and development for the sake of some fictitious greenhouse gas goals? Well, the answer is no, of course not. And so they cornered the Chinese negotiator in Peru, I believe it was 2014, and they asked him about this clause. And you know what his answer was? Our purpose is to enforce the Framework Convention, not to change it. Because they know they have a sweetheart deal. They can increase to 2030 under Paris, and after that they can just say, Article 4 in the UNFCCC, our first and overriding priority. Forget those targets. So this is so ridiculous. It doesn't even set a good example that the world is going to follow because they're not going to follow.
So we're masticating ourselves for absolutely no reason.
Yeah, exactly. The world is not going to follow. and we'll pay all this money and get nothing but heartache.
Now, does India too has an opt-out clause, right?
Well, yeah, all developing countries. And in fact, India is 70% coal. So you're ending up with India is going to make the same argument because, of course, they're not going to turn off their cheapest form of power. And coal, generally speaking, across the world is the cheapest form of power.
Well, the island of Madagascar is nothing but one large coal hump.
Is that right?
mean, yeah, they're cutting down their rainforests because they won't let them develop groups like World Wildlife Fund and Greenpeace and all these enviro wacko groups, the green wing nuts, I call them. They mount huge campaigns costing millions of dollars every time somebody even looks at that island and says, why don't we let them use their own coal? And what's happening, because they say, well, we got to protect the rainforest. We can't have coal. Well, here's what happens. If you don't let them have coal, they go out into the rainforest, the indigenous population. They cut down green trees because they haven't got time to wait for them to dry. They burn them inside their little huts, and they die from indoor smoke pollution by cooking over a wet wood fire. They have to have heat to cook.
Well, if we really wanted to help these people, we should be giving them the technology. I mean, if we wanted to give it to them, probably make more sense to sell it to China. But regardless, we should give them clean technology so they can remove the pollutants from the coal stations, which you can do. It's available. That technology
clean
is
coal
there.
technology has been around since George Bush was the president.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember him talking about it. And they liquefy the coal. They burn it far more efficiently now.
Oh, yeah.
And there are other technologies out there. Like, what about just taking high-efficiency incineration and burning garbage?
Yeah.
And
a friend of mine, he's an Egyptian. He worked for the energy department in Egypt, and he was on a tour in Sweden. And they took him on a tour, which took him to a coal station, coal generating electricity, that was right beside a kindergarten. And he asked them, "It's right beside a kindergarten." They said, "That's fine. It's very clean." So I mean, you can burn coal in a very clean fashion if you use the latest technology.
That's right.
So, yeah, help the developing countries use that technology, but forget about carbon dioxide.
Well, they won't do that.
Yeah.
One of the other things that's in the news, and Joseph, feel free to jump in here anytime you want to.
No, I'm just enjoying the conversation. It's very informative, very educational, and I'm hoping that people listening are getting the same value out of this that I get every time Tom stops in.
Well, I certainly hope so, too.
Thank you.
Okay. If you were to pick one company and one family out of all of the companies and families in Canada to give $12 million to, who would be one name not on that list?
Loblaws?
Yes.
Yes,
very
they're doing
good.
really well.
That's right. They made $750 million last year. So the government, in its wisdom, under its climate change initiative or whatever the heck you want to call it, whatever program the climate Barbie's got going on right now, and I'm going to continue to call her that. And I know she doesn't like it, but tough. Can't take the heat, stay out of the kitchen. They decided to give Loblaws, one of the most successful companies in Canada. Galen Weston is worth over $7 billion. Since January, his own personal wealth, has gone up by $105 million. No, $700 million. It goes up $100 million a day.
He's doing well.
He's doing fine.
But
I'm not knocking that.
No, I know that. But we're getting into the weeds on how much money they have, and I don't.
But there's a point to it.
The point is they can afford to do it themselves.
Precisely. That's
an issue. But the bigger issue for me is not so much can they or can't they afford it. Of course they can afford it. For me, the bigger question is why are you doing this? The whole purpose of imposing a tax, a carbon tax, is to encourage businesses and consumers to spend their own money to reduce their carbon footprint. So it just seems to me that you have two initiatives here that are working at cross purposes to one another. If you're going to give Loblaws or any other company money to convert because you want them to reduce their carbon footprint, then give them the money. If you don't want to give them the money, but you still want to encourage them to make changes, then you impose a tax which increases the cost of carbon consumption. This is the theory anyway, which then induces them to spend their own money. So I don't understand the rationale in raising the cost of carbon fuel or carbon consumption through a tax, and then saying we're going to subsidize the conversion or whatever they're doing in order to reduce the cost to this corporation that they have as a result of the tax. It's nonsensical to me. I mean, I'm quite apart from whether or not you should have a carbon tax, quite apart from the specific question, which is valid, as to whether or not Loblaws can afford to pay for this themselves. Quite apart from that, this is a nonsensical policy. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah,
I can't. You know what? You're absolutely right. I was just coming at it from a little bit different angle,
right?
Because I don't think there's any doubt we both agree with that.
It's sort of like they impose a carbon tax so that I'm paying more for gasoline, and the rationale behind that is I'm going to reduce my driving, in order to reduce my costs. That's what the tax is for. But because I'm paying the tax and I don't want to have to pay the tax, and they don't want to pay a political price for taxing me, they're now going to give me a rebate to cover the cost of the increased cost of the fuel. It doesn't make sense.
It just balances out. I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to satisfy all different arguments and constituencies all at the same time.
Yeah, they're trying to please everybody.
Yeah, but you can't do that. Can I make a plug for something that I think that...
Right, sure.
There's a couple of things here. First of all, I think people have got to get a hold of Dr. Ball's book, because it's called, and I'll just pull out the exact title here, Human-Caused Global Warming, the Biggest Deception in History. And you can pick that up through Amazon, and he talks about how the climate scare got going, how it was fed by the UN, why they're doing it. In many cases, there's a lot of nefarious motivations.
Yes, there is.
The other thing I wanted to plug was the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change reports. Now, people have heard of the IPCC, but how many people have heard of the NIPCC? The NIPCC puts out a series of reports, really phenomenal reports. This is one of the ones I gave to the minister, actually, called Climate Change Reconsidered, And the webpage is very easy. People can look it up. It's climatechangereconsidered.org. And it has literally thousands of references from peer-reviewed science journals that shows that virtually every single element of the climate scare is either wrong or in great debate. So when you hear from the minister, the science is settled, all you have to do is say, what about this? Because these are leading scientists across the world. The most recent report is specifically on the benefits of fossil fuels. The fossil fuels are not only giving us benefit from an economic point of view, but they benefit the environment in many ways, because fossil fuels lead to, of course, a wealthier country, which we can then afford to protect our environment.
Right.
But also, it's the direct CO2 fertilization effect. CO2 is aerial fertilizer. It not only allows plants to grow faster, but it allows them to grow with less water. And that's really important. You mentioned this earlier, because it means that as CO2 rises in the Earth's atmosphere, parts of the Earth that currently cannot support plants will start to be able to support plants. So this is something people should look up. And even just looking at the volume of material that counters what, as you say, Minister McKenna, Climate Barbie as you call her, virtually every single argument that she's presenting is completely countered by these reports. ClimateChangeReconsidered.org.
Well, it's funny because I've gotten into this debate many times, and I always ask at least this question, and that is, tell me what's wrong with making Canada a degree or two warmer. You like frostbite? Yeah. You like shoveling snow? I mean, come on. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a long enough growing season up here to grow strawberries?
Well, not only that, the warming is forecast, according to the models, and of course you can't really believe them, but if you did, it's forecast to occur at high latitudes at night in the winter. So, you're talking about, at night in the high latitudes in the winter, it's night all the time. But, do you think there's any life forms on Earth that would be detrimentally affected if it was minus 45 instead of minus 50? I mean, obviously not. And, people talk about polar bears. Oh, my God, the polar bears are doing just fine.
Absolutely.
In fact, there's about 5 times more that they count now than 1960.
Yep.
Who are in danger is not the polar bears, but the Inuit children, because the polar bears are wandering into communities looking for food because there's so many of them.
And those little kids make nice light snacks.
Yeah. So, I was reading the other day that they're issuing more hunting rifles as a result.
Absolutely. People actually are putting plywood over their, up in Churchill, they have sheets of plywood over their windows with 5-inch spikes stuck through them so the polar bears can't push the windows in.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, if you've ever been stalked by a polar bear, you know that they're not a fragile animal at all.
They cover their nose because it's the only black part. And the snow creeps towards you till it's too late.
Yeah. Well, as I say, take a look at Human-Caused Global Warming, the biggest deception in history. People will enjoy that. Dr. Ball's book.
Tom, it's been a blast.
The phone. Beep, beep.
Yeah, my phone is beeping away now. I don't know. I pushed some wrong button or whatever. Tom Harris is our guest for the last hour. It's been a blast, Tom. We always love you when you come in. Tell me, what's the
our webpage?
Website?
Yeah, it's climatechangeinternational.org. Climate Change International.
.org.
Yeah, and go to climatechangereconsidered.org.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for coming in, Tom. We appreciate you always. And hopefully you will stop again at some point in time in the near future.
Sure. Thank you, Joseph, and thank you, Nick.
It's been a pleasure, Tom. Always is.
Okay, we're going for a break. We will catch you guys on the other side.
The Combat Zone, Hour 2, straight ahead. I'm Nick, he's Joseph. I want to thank our guest, Tom Harris, in the previous hour. He's always entertaining to have on. He's has so much information at his fingertips. And to take the time to go and have a look at the different websites. I was just looking at, over the break, looking at the one, Climate Change Reconsidered, and holy smokes, there's a lot of stuff on that site. So if you get into a battle with these sky is falling crowd, if you're not a member of that fraternity, then you've got some ammunition that you can work with. Anyway.
Just before we go on, Nick, I want to just point out to people that in the last segment, towards the end, Tom was talking about, he referred to Dr. Tim Ball's book, Human-Caused Global Warming, The Biggest Deception in History. So I've already put up a link to that on Amazon. So if you click on that, or if you want to look at it, you just have to refresh the live player page that you're on right now, and you'll be able to click on the link and take a look at the book, and if you feel so inclined, purchase it as well. So we already have a link up to that particular book.
That's what I like about you, Joseph. You don't waste any time, man. When the iron's hot, you strike.
Well, I try to, Nick.
Yes,
I do try.
Look, I don't have any problem promoting books like that because it's such important information. My dad used to tell me that only dead fish go with the flow. And far too many people get swept along in the climate change hysteria because it's, on one hand, it's, they've been taught to believe the people in white trench coats no matter what they say. And on the other hand, it's simple intellectual laziness. It's easy just to say, yeah, okay, we support that, rather than take the time to do the research and figure out the truth. Or at least, take a look at a second opinion, something that doesn't fit with your worldview, but might be worth considering. So books like that certainly fill that void.
Right. And we're also opening the phone lines to anybody who wants to jump in and take part in the conversation live anywhere in North America. Toll free 844-415-2115. The number again, toll free anywhere in North America, 844-415-2115. We didn't have the phones open in the last hour, Nick, so I just thought that it would be wise to throw
Let
that
people know they're
little
open
bit
now.
of housekeeping information as well.
All right, well, let's move on to other topics. There's plenty of stuff in the news. Doug Ford is bringing down, or Doug Ford's government is bringing down, that'd be Vic Fideli, right? He's
I
the finance
believe
minister?
Vic Fideli is the Minister of Finance. So
Yes.
it's the Ontario government bringing down its budget tomorrow, Thursday, April the 11th, right? Good thing they didn't do it on April Fool's Day last week.
good
That would
Lord.
have been a little bit silly.
Yes.
Well, it's funny how I could just see how people would be having a field day with the idea that a government would introduce a budget on April Fool's Day. But if it's a conservative government, but it seems that whole thing has been lost on anyone with respect to the Liberal government, at least Liberal partisans, with respect to anything that they did last week. The climate
Yeah.
the climate alarm,
leaked climate
the
document.
leaked climate document, et
Right,
cetera,
and
yeah.
the carbon tax on the same
The
day.
carbon tax coming out on the... Now, who planned that, of course, right?
Listen, that was done on purpose. I have no doubt.
Of course, the drive clean test was eliminated as of April 1st as well.
That is true, but that's no joke.
That's no joke. And speaking about jokes, right, in the last segment, Nick made a joke about North Carolina and North Dakota being both northern states. And on the break, I have to tell you, I said to Nick, Nick, North Carolina is a southern state. And he said, yes, I know. I was making a joke. So Nick made a joke, and I just wanted to point out that if there's anyone out there that thought that Nick was getting his American geography wrong, you were wrong. He was just making that joke.
That's right. They both have North in the name. North
Right.
Dakota, North Carolina. But for anybody who knows anything about American history at all, North Carolina, the island, Fort
Sumter.
At Fort Sumter, is where the Civil War started. North Carolina was below the Mason-Dixon line. So
Yes,
it was
it
part
was.
of the South.
Yes, it was.
Anyway, did you know that Fort Sumter never surrendered during the whole Civil War?
I did not know that.
Yes, it was a Union fort from day one, and they never were able to take it away from the Union forces.
That is interesting, if accurate.
Well, as far as I know, it's accurate.
Okay, well, that's fine.
Yes.
Look, let's talk a little bit about this budget.
Yes, let's do that.
There are some aspects. Obviously, we don't know what all of the details are, except for what's been leaked. And it used to be that finance ministers resigned if anything from their budget was leaked to the public. But now, of course, it's become standard practice for governments to leak details of the budget.
It's kind of like if a government was a ship, it would sink at its moorings with all the leaks.
That's a good, absolutely good marine analogy.
As soon as I heard the word leak, I thought, man, the pumps. And then I realized the water's coming in so fast, the pumps are useless.
Now, one of the things that apparently the government is going to do, and I'm going to take issue with it, and, Robert is out there listening in cyberspace somewhere. Robert, I know you hate it when I play devil's advocate, and it sounds like I'm defending the Liberals. In this case, I'm going to play devil's advocate, and it's going to sound like I'm criticizing the Conservatives. But if I'm going to criticize Conservatives, I'm going to criticize them as a Conservative from a Conservative perspective. So here's the thing. Allegedly, apparently, and I have no reason to doubt this, and I think it'll be confirmed tomorrow afternoon, included in this budget will be a provision to provide parents with cash for sending or to help cover the costs of caring for their children while they work. So call it child care subsidy, call it daycare subsidy, call it whatever you wish. And I don't have the numbers in front of me. I know, Nick, you were looking some of them up, but I don't think the numbers are really important. I'm not a very big believer, Nick, in government playing the role of parent. And I understand that you have children, and I understand you have to go to work, and it's expensive to care for the kids. There's no question about that, Nick. What I object to is the idea that the way to respond to that problem is by paying parents money from tax dollars in order to help them to afford childcare. when there are two things, other more conservative responses that I think are, in this case, more appropriate. The first is we know that the single biggest line item in personal budgets today are taxes. So, somewhere in the order, I think the Fraser Institute did a study on this a few years ago, and they found that somewhere in the order of the average Canadian family was paying somewhere in the order of 40, 41, 42% of their income towards taxes of one form or another.
That's right.
So clearly, the number one reason why lower and middle class families can't afford things like daycare is because of the tax burden. And if you want to help people to afford, then reduce their taxes. Don't hold the taxes at a certain level and then hand them out more money. That's I think, a more reasonable solution to the problem. The second thing is, one has to ask themselves what's driving the higher cost of daycare. And I think that one of the reasons why daycare is higher is because of regulation. So reduce regulation in the daycare sector. Okay, give parents more opportunity to choose. Let the market decide what is a reasonable price, and reduce taxes on parents so that they can afford to spend their money on caring for their children or doing something else. So I haven't really prepared remarks around this. I'm maybe not articulating it very well, but I just think that it's a fundamentally unconservative response to what is obviously a real problem.
Now, so let me play devil's advocate for a minute, because I agree with you. I think that the best thing you can do is cut taxes and keep the money in the parents' pockets so they can spend it as they wish to look after their own children. That's what I believe in. However, there are those who are going to say, well, we can't get rid of regulation. We have safety concerns. What if some pedophile gets a hold of them?
Well, pedophile's still a pedophile, whether they're working
regardless
in
of
a
the
regulated
law.
or an unregulated.
Right. So, and that's one answer. The other thing is, well, what happens if and maybe it's not pedophilia, but there's some people who mistreat children or have different, they don't conform to a standard. Well, neither does any one family. Like the whole point of allowing parents of the state interfering with how parents raise their children is to, I'm saying this all backwards. What I'm trying to say is the state has no business telling the parents what an acceptable standard is for how they raise their children. Now, I'm not talking about allowing physical beatings where the kid goes into an emergency room with broken bones and black eyes and things like that. Nobody wants to see that. That's a criminal offense anyway. That's called assault and battery.
Of course.
And we have laws for that.
We have laws prohibiting that already.
Right. So we don't need any more of this stuff. But state, I'm using the word state in the royal sense here. When a state gets involved in these kinds of programs, it's like you're hooking the electorate on their own cash, or you're making them addicts, because if you take that burden off their shoulders, then they don't got to worry about it. They just drop little Jimmy or little Janie off at daycare. Yes, it costs them some money to do it, but the government hands them back some cash, and it makes it so much easier. They don't have to think about it.
Well, Nick, you know what it is, right? You know what it is, right?
We are the government. You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile.
Yeah, that's that's pretty much what it is. Making them good little slaves.
Listen, and that's clearly not the intention. And
but that's the effect.
But that is the effect. The fact of the matter is that you are making these parents dependent on state largesse, government largesse, and you're doing it for altruistic reasons. I'm prepared to grant you that, but nonetheless, that's the effect. Look, it's like painkiller, okay? Someone's in pain, they had surgery, they sprained their knee, they sprained their ankle, whatever. You give them painkillers, you're doing it for altruistic reasons. But, at some point in time, if you keep on handing painkillers out like candy, they become addicted. And now you're doing more harm than good. So maybe I don't think the analogy is perfect there, but the bottom line is this, okay? It's our money. It's taxpayers' money. Don't take it out of the pocket of taxpayers and then redistribute it based on an assessment as to who you think deserves it. Now, I know I'm going to have a lot of friends out there who are hooting and hollering now, including a lot of conservative friends that are going, yeah, but we're helping the family. That's the right conservative thing to do. Well, it's better than taking it away from the family and then somehow or other forcing families to use state-owned and operated daycare. Okay, I'll grant you that.
Yep.
But really, in the end, I think the effect is the same. You're disenfranchising. You're eliminating the independence, undermining the independence of families and parents. And in the end, I think that's a terrible thing because then you're leaving them at the mercy of the state. And as I always say, if you're going to create a department or a policy or grant to the government a particular power, then it's really important that you hit the pause button and you ask yourself this: is this power or this type of initiative something that I want my political opponents to have when I'm not in office? Because inevitably I will not be in office and they will be. And the idea of having parents at the mercy of government, I cannot abide that.
Well, they already are. And one of the things I take issue with the Ford government is the fact that so far, to the best of my knowledge, the law is still on the books that allows the state to come in and take away your child from you if you discourage them from acting out on feelings that some might call transgendered. And you can't say, look, little Johnny, if little Johnny says to you, well, I feel like a girl today, you can't say, well, don't worry, that's a phase, it'll pass, right? You're obviously a boy, and, you can't do that because the state has the power in law to come in and remove your child.
Well, it's now grounds for, as you say, it's now, if your child comes home at 4 or 5 or 6 years old from school or junior K or kindergarten, and they say, Mom, Dad, I think I'm a boy, or I don't like being a boy. Every family has tomboys.
That's right.
But I don't feel like a girl. I like doing boy stuff, and if you don't then take that and treat it as an indication of gender dysphoria and look for some sort of treatment for the child, that in itself now can be grounds for having the child removed from your home.
Right.
Or if they say something to the teacher, the teacher goes ahead and investigates and reports it, and then the child is receiving some kind of guidance in this area in school that if you actively oppose and object to it, then that would be grounds for having the child removed from the home as well. So not just, you don't even have to beat your child anymore. You just have to tell them, your daughter, when you're getting dressed for church on Sunday morning, you know what, young lady, you're wearing a proper dress today.
Yeah.
That would be grounds for.
So the question becomes, why is that still in the books?
Well, it's a great question, Nick, and this, we've talked about this kind of thing before, so it's not going to be a surprise to you when I say that I don't have high expectations of conservative political parties that get into office espousing, when they're running, solid conservative principles and then following through when they get into office, because typically they don't. And I think that there are a number of reasons why that is. I don't know that this is the time to start going into it, but I think that we need to have stronger voices or institutions and perhaps even political parties that are more to the right of some of the more mainstream, if you want to call them that, conservative political parties or nominally conservative political parties, in order to hold their feet to the fire. It just seems that every time their feet are held to the fire, it's always lefties that are doing it. It's always the liberals and the progressives that are holding conservative feet to the fire. So they're naturally pulled in that direction, and there's very little pulling them in the other direction, notwithstanding the fact that there is I think a huge constituency in this country, in society, for greater respect for parental rights and a little bit more common sense when it comes to treating the kinds of things that we're just referring to with respect to children.
So when all this to say that with the government's budget coming down tomorrow, this idea about giving out money for daycare to people who don't even, sometimes in some cases, don't even pay taxes, is just another form of wealth redistribution. There's better ways to accomplish the same thing. If you really want to support families, then just cut taxes for everybody. Just, across the board. Like, why doesn't the government come out tomorrow and say, you know what, gas went up by 4.4 cents because Trudeau won't listen about carbon tax. We're going to cut our share of the taxes because they get a ton of money out of gas. We're going to cut 4.4 cents out of the price of gas to make the whole thing null and void. Just make it a zero-sum game. Because we strongly believe this is an unfair tax, and we're going to prove it. Why don't they do that? It's all showmanship. Like, they're going to put stickers on the gas pumps, and they're going to say one in English, one in French, 4.4%. Well, you know what? They already have stickers on the pumps. In many pumps, when you pull up to them, it shows you the cost of gas, the excise tax, the road tax, and in some cases percentage, and in some cases when it gets to the HST, it's a percent. Everything else is in cents per liter or gallon, whatever it is.
Right.
Okay. So they're going to put another sticker on the pump. Well, how much good did the last ones do?
Well, it's a fair question. I'm just looking at what Marin has written here in the comments section, Nick, and about the child care subsidy that seems to be coming provincially in tomorrow's budget. There are studies that show that giving poor people money, that when you give poor people money, they'll invest it in having more children, and that's a good reason for it. Or there is a reason for it. I don't know whether or not it's a good reason, but, that might be a positive effect, although, one could make the argument, Marin, that if you're going to do that, isn't it ironic that you would be increasing the number of children that poor families have? And doesn't that add to the poverty in the family, and then force the government to, in fact, give more subsidies to the families that are having it? Look, one can make a judgment as to whether this is a good policy or a bad policy on its own merits. What you're helping parents afford quality child care. That's not a bad thing in and of itself. You're encouraging families to have children. If that's your goal, that's not a bad thing either. But I just think that in principle, all of those things, all of those factors that go into decisions as to what I'm going to do with my children, how I'm going to raise my children, how many children that we're going to have, I don't think that those are decisions that should be influenced by the state. And I don't think the state has any kind of an interest in trying to influence those decisions. Now, that may be a very libertarian point of view, but the problem with all of this is that if you allow the state to have that kind of influence and that kind of control, it's nice to say that they're doing it for positive reasons now, but they could very well do it for negative reasons as well. And who's to say that ultimately, in the long run, the good that we think that we're doing today isn't going to turn out to be bad 2 years or 4 years or 5 years down the road,
or get turned on its head when the next government takes place.
Right. So the best policy is get off of people's backs, get out of their pockets, let them live their lives to the best of their ability, according to their own lights, and just stay out of their lives. Now, I'm a conservative. I'm not a libertarian. I do believe that there's a role for government to play. I'm not saying we shouldn't have laws and that it should be a free-for-all. I'm not in favor of anarchy. But I am saying that we're too deeply involved in controlling and molding the lives of citizens and families today. And I just think it's fundamentally wrong.
Well, I'm not going to argue.
That's my rant.
Okay, well, that was a good one.
You think that was good?
Yeah, I did, because you're basically saying the same thing I would. Cut taxes, lower the cost of doing business, and everything else will take care of itself. If you have people who want to move up or down the economic chain, most people want to move up, and the best thing you can do for them is give them a job. And the best way to create a job is to make businesses more viable, because they're going to need employees. Now, not every job is equal, of course not, but every job you have adds to your CV and makes you more employable. So if you cut taxes, not only for person for the individual or the household, but for business as well, all of a sudden now you've got a free market that can respond to any need that the family has much faster and much more efficiently than any government ever could. We fall into the trap in this country of thinking the only people who can solve problems is the government. And as Ronald Reagan used to say, that the most terrifying sentence in the English language is, "Hi, I'm here from the government. I'm here to help." You know, like, holy cow, get off my farm, get out of my house. You know, I don't need your help. Your kind of help I am not interested in.
Okay, Nick, we're coming up to the bottom of the hour, so
Wow.
let's take another break, and we will see you on the other side here in the Combat Zone on thinkradio.ca. Okay, I am Joe. He is Nick, and you are entering back into the Combat Zone, where we are against government taking over our lives.
We are the government. You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile.
Well, Nick, resistance is not futile.
Not around here.
Not around here.
We are not going to let the Borg win. We will run them.
Okay, so we've spent, the first hour talking about climate change and
Yep.
the climate change, man-made climate change fraud. And I want to remind our listeners to click on the link on the page. It's just above the player. And go to, which will take you to Amazon, take a look at the book, and purchase Dr. Ball's book on the subject. And believe me, it'll be money well spent money. So we talked a little bit about that. We've talked about daycare, role of government, etc. But I think it's time for us to get into something really serious here, Nick, and that's the fact that it appears that we are now going to be able to do tailgating before football games in the fall in
would
Ontario.
not believe the number of people, when I was listening to terrestrial radio today and on social media, who can't believe they're going to allow this to happen. So now you're for public drunkenness. Now you're for, what about safety? I'm going, oh my God.
Not public drunkenness, just drunkenness in the parking lot at the football game.
Listen, what do you think happens when they go to a hockey game? Like out here on the 417, they go to the Palladium, right? Or Canadian Tire
Canadian
Center.
Tire Center now.
Yeah, that's right. They rename these things so often it makes you can't keep track. They go to a major sporting event. Let me put it that way, and they sell beer. Do you think those guys stop after one?
Forget about beer. When was the last time you went to a music concert?
Yeah, it's like a fog.
A fog of marijuana smoke.
Yeah.
You cannot go to an indoor concert
and not get
get high, not get stoned. It's virtually impossible.
Oh man. Anyway, so this whole idea about tailgating, I think, is a great idea.
But Nick, marijuana's legal now. I could hear the same. It'll be the same people making that argument, right?
I know.
The same people that are against drinking in a parking lot. And by the way, you know what? Just because you're tailgating doesn't mean you're getting drunk. It doesn't even mean you're drinking. Tailgating is not about wandering around the parking lot drinking. It's about bringing your hibachi, firing it up, and having some steaks or burgers or hot dogs before the game.
That's right.
It's a great tradition.
Absolutely. I am just blown away that we're such stick in the muds that we don't understand that one of the things that the Americans do really well is they know how to throw a party. And if there's all kinds of examples from the Super Bowl. Look at Las Vegas last year in the Stanley Cup final. Okay, it was an event. You didn't go just to watch a hockey game. It was a whole performance. They had sword fights in the middle of the ice. They had cannons going off. They put on this whole huge production. If you go to watch a college football game, there's 30,000 people just in the parking lot, and they're all barbecuing, steaks or whatever.
Well, we're only a couple of hours, 3 hours, I guess, close to 3 hours up the road from Syracuse, where the Orangemen play, the University of Syracuse. They have a domed stadium that holds more than 60,000 people for college football, for pity's sake.
Oh yeah, but football down there is like hockey up here.
Well, you cannot get 20,000 people for a college hockey game here.
No, not for college, no, but for the NHL you can.
Well, for the NHL, yeah, but
of course,
that's like the NFL,
right?
Anyway, it's. I think this is a great thing. I was always against the prudish rules that said you couldn't have a hibachi in the parking lot, fire up a couple of burgers or whatever, get to know your friends and neighbors, a little bit of friendly rivalry there, Nick, between the Red Blacks fans and the Tiger Cats fans.
Yeah. Yeah.
Husky wee wee, man.
You got her, buddy. We like our meat raw.
Yeah. By the way, I am not a Tiger Cats fan.
I
Nick
am.
Is. Okay, we're getting really very into the weeds here on stuff that people, people really care about this. This is actually far more important to people, obviously.
I was just going to say it's not really that far off the beaten track because let's face it, Canada, if it's not hockey, they have a hard time supporting it. And when it comes to professional
I'm sorry, if it's
sports,
not what? I was in the middle of a cough there.
I said if it's not hockey, if it's not the NHL, and maybe the major juniors where all the NHL players come from, where the farm teams are. A lot of those are in the States, by the way. There's just this attitude, well, it's not hockey. Now, I will say that about soccer. I think soccer is one of the most boring sports ever invented by the mind of man. I mean, it's just dull as to watch it. There's only a handful of things more dull than soccer. One is golf, the other one is darts, and the most boring thing I've ever seen is British carp fishing. I won't go into the details, but let's just say if you need a nap, you just turn that on.
Well, all I could say, Nick, is that my game was rugby. So rugby union, not that sissy sport rugby league. For all you rugby league guys out there.
Yeah, both of them.
Okay, just remember, right? 15 men and real scrummaging. Not that sissy stuff. It's.
I have no idea what he's talking about.
Okay, Nick doesn't know what I'm talking. Nick does not know but you out there, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, for those. Yeah, okay. But the point I'm making is. Hockey's like a religion in this country, and it's one of the few things that actually binds us together. Look at the Humboldt situation. But outside of that, it's very hard to come up with support for a professional league.
Yeah, well, just on the hockey thing, I just want to point out that there are Toronto Maple Leaf fans,
and then there's everybody
the rest
else
of the country that are waiting for the collapse.
The collapse has not happened. They're in the playoffs.
Not yet, because they haven't started playing yet.
Well, now, the question is what kind of collapse? Are you talking about making the playoffs? Well, check that off because we did it.
Well, you did it last year too, didn't you?
Yes, we did.
Sorry, how many goals did you guys let in the last period of Game 7?
Look, we don't need to go there. And, hey, how many games would it take the Bruins to before they finally beat us?
Oh,
and we have a better team this year than we did then.
Okay, well, we'll see what happens.
You got it.
Anyway, there you go. We have, and all those guys, we have people that are listening now in Central Africa.
They're not the Kenyan. They're
wondering what is going on.
The Kenyan Lions know exactly what's going on.
Kenyan Lions.
Yep.
Okay, but you know what they do in South Africa?
What?
Play rugby. Not that sissy rugby league stuff either. Rugby union.
I'll have a lot more respect for rugby when they start using cricket bats to move the ball around.
Yeah, we don't need cricket bats in rugby.
Oh.
Okay.
Shows you how much I know. All right. So, tailgate.
Have we gotten off topic here?
Now we
tailgating.
Have. We're talking about rugby in Kenya. We are way off topic.
Tailgating. No, I think it's a great idea. I'm glad that the government is loosening up in this area, and I think it's a great idea, and I think that it'll make for some real fun and camaraderie at the ballpark in the fall.
I think this is one of the moves that Doug Ford's made that I really like. And it's because, first of all, it's a no-brainer. It's easy. It doesn't cost anybody anything. There's no taxes involved. One of the reasons why
in fact, you might actually generate more tax revenue from all the beer people are going to buy.
That's right. And the steaks and the hibachis and the charcoal to run the hibachis with.
And don't forget the carbon tax on the propane and the charcoal.
Oh, please don't get me started again.
That's for the Doug Ford government.
That's right. We tromp on them when they need tromping, but we'll give them a pat on the back when they get it right.
Yes.
Now, that's...
Should we give a shout-out to Justin Trudeau? Oh, no, wait a minute. That's Jade Philpott.
No, the shout-out to Justin Trudeau is a chorus of booze.
I don't have booze here.
What you need to do is listen to...
I'll have to get some booze here.
Yeah, find some booze from when senators get booed off the ice.
Okay, we're getting really silly here, Nick. It's been a long day.
Yeah, okay.
Let's get on to something more serious.
Okay, well, now there's the other thing they've done, and by they I mean the Doug Ford government, is they're revamping the license plates. On commercial vehicles, they're going to say the license plate slogan will be open for business. And think about it. You're talking about, anything that carries commercial freight or is a commercial vehicle. A lot of those things are tractor trailers, which drive all over North America. It's not much like it's not exactly what I call the greatest advertising scheme in the world, but it does get the message out there in some form and fashion that Ontario is open. Now, excuse me.
That Ontario is open for business.
That's what I was trying to say.
You're trying to say they're Ontario's. What are they doing for the residential or the non-commercial vehicles? Because I think they're changing the slogan on both, right?
Yeah, they are. I want to say yours to discover, but isn't that already what it is?
It's yours to discover now. I believe they're changing it to
a place to grow. Well, that's a line out of
the Ontario song
from 1967.
That's right, the centennial year.
Yeah, a place to work, a place to grow, Ontario. Yes.
Yeah, and until we were playing that song the other day.
That's why it's
right?
fresh in my mind.
That's why it's in your mind. And I heard that, Ontario.
Yeah.
And it's the first time I actually heard a recording of that song. I knew the song, the tune, and I knew some of the words. But I always thought that it was Ontario, a place to stand, a place to go, and call this land Ontario. But instead, they came up with this Ontario, and of course, the whole chorus is singing it with the orchestra in the background. You could just see everybody jumping up and down and high fiving, and the fireworks going off, and then Ontario, and I'm going, okay, they sound like rugby league players, sissies.
Boy, once you get this rugby thing going, it's hard to get off that track, isn't it?
Isn't it? Okay, yeah.
So
we're just
in
having
general,
a little bit of fun. No, I believe it's a place to grow. I think that's what they're changing it to. And I hear that they're talking about eliminating the front license plate as well. That's
getting
another
closer
thing that's
to
on
what
the
I
table.
want. They're getting closer every day to what I want, and that's to remove that stupid sticker on the license plate. You want to actually put some money back in people's pockets? That's what you do. If you have a car or two, you're going to spend $250 a year licensing those things again and again and again and again. Why? My pet. This is a pet peeve of mine, and I've been driving me nuts every time I have to put another one on my car. Anyway, so in general, I don't see this as a huge expense. What I do hope is they upgrade the license plates so the finish doesn't come off like the current ones do. How many times have somebody driven by you, or you driven by somebody else, and the actual laminate on the paint, like it's painted and coated with a laminate, the paint and the laminate are off, and you see aluminum underneath. And it's just flapping in the wind. Sometimes it's all gone altogether. Now, I'm hoping that they fix that too. Because somebody, I think, mentioned that.
I heard somebody mention it recently. I don't know if it was on our show or in the comments section or whatever.
I think that's where it was, in the chat room last week. But and it might have even been Marin who made the point. And I said, yeah, I hope they fix that too. I agree with you. Because let's face it.
I have to confess to you, I've never run across that problem. I've never seen a license plate
I've seen it
that.
a dozen
I'm not
times.
questioning that it's doing it. I just personally, I don't recall ever seeing it.
Oh, it's been a big problem because now if that comes off, are you supposed to replace your plate, and who pays? It's not your fault that the government can't make a decent license plate. Do you paint it over with hand paint? Is that forging a government document? What if the sticker comes off with it? Now what? Well, you've got the back of your registration. That's true. Anyway, so license plates. I'm certainly. I think that it's certainly time to look at a new slogan, and if this helps in some small way to get the message out that Ontario really is back and open for business, then fine. I don't have a problem with it because you had to fix the license plate problem anyway. So why not do it all at once?
Right. I don't really care one way or the other about it. It's to me, it's just window dressing.
Yeah, it is.
I don't think Ontario open for business on commercial plates is going to increase foreign investment in Ontario. I don't think that switching from yours to discover to a place to grow is going to increase tourism one way or the other. And look, I don't get me wrong, I'm not opposed to these changes. But you know what I really want to know? I really want to know how much was spent on focus groups and discussion groups and polling, etc., before the decision was made to make these two changes.
There's two possible answers. Way too much or none.
Right. Well, which is the more likely of the two possible answers?
Way too much.
Way too much. I mean, it could... Now, I don't have any evidence of this, so I'm being careful. I don't want to speculate idly, but, okay, well, maybe I will. No, it's not idle speculation for me to say that I have seen quite literally hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, going into these kinds of changes just on the study side of things. I mean, the federal government, when they changed from Foreign Affairs, which are constantly changing the name of the Foreign Affairs Department. And shortly after Trudeau and the Liberals came to power, they changed it again to Global Affairs. And just think of how much money had to be spent just to do that. Forget about the paper, etc., the actual hard costs, but the cost of actually analyzing it, thinking about it, studying it, circulating the memo, etc. It gets quite colossal when you talk about government bureaucracy. The people would be really shocked to learn how much money is spent in these kinds of deliberations. So that's what I'm saying. I think I would rather see the money spent more wisely, or more, not wisely, more practically than this.
Yes.
And if you don't have something practical to spend it on, give it back. It's my money.
Well, there's always that's always in my mind the smartest thing to do. I don't have a real bone to pick with changing license plates. I know it's not going to make a whole lot of difference as far as trade or tourism is concerned. I think you're right, but at the same time, it's a small thing in comparison to how much the government spends on other things. So I'm not too worried about that.
No, I'm not going to let you get away with that, Nick. I'm not going to let you get away with that. It may be very little money, but it's still not their money.
Yeah.
I remember I was in a council, sitting as a spectator in a council meeting here in Ottawa when they were discussing changing implementing the automatic GPS bus station or bus stop announcements.
I remember that.
Okay. And it wasn't a lot of, I mean, it was, depends on how you mean by a lot of money. I don't remember the exact amount, but it was in the millions of dollars to implement this particular program. And afterwards, I was talking to one of the councillors, and they said, "Yeah, it's it's." I was saying, I don't see what the safety issue is with the bus driver just, with a little microphone calling out the name of the stop. It's a safety issue, and they said, "Well, you're right, but it's not a lot of money. It's not a lot of money." And I immediately responded the way I just did with you. It may not be a lot of money, but it's not your money. It's my money and it's their money. So the amount is not what's important. What's important is it necessary to spend it? And I don't know that it's necessary to spend any money on this stuff. But just me.
Maybe
I
hear
being
exactly
too
what
much of
you're
a hard
saying.
ass here, but
you know what? They're not going. First of all, you have to face the fact they're not going to give it back. That's number one. Number two, if they don't spend it on something like this, God knows what they'll spend it on, and it's going to be worse than this. So I'm just picking the lesser of two evils. Because I agree with you. I think if you don't need it, the first thing that should happen, you've got two choices. Remember when we were running those surpluses at the federal level? They should have split that money into two groups. Half of it go into against the debt, not the deficit, but the debt.
right.
Okay, and the other half...
by definition, if you're running a surplus, you don't have a deficit anyway.
Well, that's true. So
Right.
it goes against the debt.
Right.
But the other half gets returned to the taxpayer in relation to how much they actually paid in taxes. So if you paid $10,000 a year in taxes, you get $10,000 back.
Right.
Or a proportion. If you paid $2 in taxes, don't expect a $10,000 check.
Right.
You know,
And it's a good point you're making, Nick, because as I always point out to people, you know, when they say it's a great thing that the government runs a surplus every year, and I'm going, no, surpluses are a surplus means you've been overtaxed. A deficit means it is deferred taxation. Surpluses are overtaxation. So I can understand running a small deficit and a small surplus from year to year and having it go up and down like that. But when you're consistently running surpluses, that means that you're being taxed too much, and that money should go back to people in every instance as tax decreases, tax reductions.
absolutely. And that's I guess the same thing. That's what I'm saying is
Why are we not running the world? That's what I want to know.
well, you know something, I've put in an application for us to be co-vicars and that we have supreme authority and that what we say goes. I haven't heard back yet. I thought it was a pretty simple plan. Just pay us $500,000 a year each and we'll run the planet.
Nick, should we apply to join the Senate? I think you and I it would be such fun being senators in this country.
Oh, yeah, we only have
Senator
to show
Nick.
up for 72 days.
Senator Nick and Joe.
Oh, God.
We
Yeah.
could do our podcast right from the floor of the Senate chamber.
Hey, do you know what? One day you show up, the next day I show up. Wednesdays we show up and do our podcast. We only got to show up between the two of us 72 days. 72 days is
I
all
think
they
it's
have
a
to show.
plan.
I'm liking it. I'm
You think
liking
so?
it. Yep, but we'll have to
If
get
anyone's out there and thinks that Nick and or I should be senators, go to the Senate or the Prime Minister's website, send them a note. I think there's an application process or whatever. We're going to look it up. We are going to post it on our website if anyone wants Nick or myself, Joe, to be a senator.
or both.
Okay, we will tell you where to go.
And we were
to let
completely
people
independent
know.
because we know that's the kind of senators he likes.
An independent, conservative-minded, common-sense senator.
That's right. They are a rare animal.
Okay,
All right. Well, good luck with that.
back to tailgating.
Yeah. Listen, you know, what we should do is we should have a tailgate party for the home opener of the Hamilton Tiger. I mean, for the for the Red Blacks.
Yeah, it depends on what day it is, but we could look into that.
Yeah.
So we have a couple of minutes left. Israeli elections.
Yeah,
looks like the Likud under Benjamin Netanyahu have squeaked out a victory.
Yes, and he won 35 seats, and with the other right of center parties, he's confident he can come up with a majority, so he'll be asked to form the government.
So this is quite fascinating because nobody has been the prime minister of Israel as long as Bibi Netanyahu. And he's really liked and he's really hated by people.
Well, that's pretty much true of almost every leader you can point to.
I guess so.
You know, the higher up the ladder you go, some people are going to help push you up and others are going to try to pick you off.
Now Netanyahu seems to have a very interesting and special relationship with President Trump. So it'll be interesting to see how things go over the next couple of years.
Well, he's done some. Trump has done some things that certainly bolster Netanyahu's position by moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, and he called actually Netanyahu from Air Force One. He didn't even wait for the plane to touch down. He got on the phone and called and congratulated him on his win.
Well, good for him.
I think so too.
I'm glad that Trump has done the things he's done, because I think that in the final analysis, people have been waiting at the status quo for so long, and quite frankly, the Palestinians have been, I think, holding the rest of the world hostage to the peace process. They have constantly a veto over whether or not they're going to progress from one stage to the next. And, at some point in time, somebody has to say enough of this. And I think that's what Trump has done. He really is shaking things up in the Middle East. I think it's for the better, but we'll have to see.
Yep. And I have always liked Netanyahu. I thought he was acted like a world-class statesman at the UN when he said, which country was it? Algeria, where are your Jews? And he just stood there for about a minute, and you could have heard a pin drop. He called him on it, and there was nothing anybody had to say. And it's just moments like that are Churchillian in their magnitude, because there is no response. He was calling them out on anti-Semitism, and he was calling them out on a bunch of stuff. And when he said that, they had no response. So it was a brilliant speech.
Okay, Nick, it was a great show tonight. Our thanks to our special guest, Tom Harris from the International Climate Science Coalition. And once more, if you want to take a look at the book that he was referring to during his interview towards the end by Dr. Tim Ball, the link is on the webpage. So we encourage you to take a look at it. Nick, until next week.
Who knows? We might be senators by then.
I doubt it, but we're going to try our best.
That's right.
Okay, adios, au revoir, and sayonara.
Good night, folks.